why don't we get started? Hello, everybody. Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Lisa Sawsville, and I'm with Vermont Coverts, Woodlands for Wildlife. And tonight we are hosting Becca Lindenmeyr from Farmcraft, Vermont, and she's going to share with us about designing habitat for our native pollinators. Pollinators are in a lot of trouble right now due to, well, she's going to cover some of that, but so having these plantings is not only fun, but it's habitat for wildlife and pollinators, and it's beautiful, and I'm really excited to have her share all about it with us. So Becca, I'm going to turn it over to you. Please share a little bit with us about Farmcraft Vermont, and then I look forward to hearing all about doing things for pollinators.
Awesome. Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, my name is Becca Lindenmeyr. My background is environmental science. I was a consultant to EPA for 9 years doing ecological restoration, and then worked for the state of Vermont for a little bit doing source water protection for Lake Champlain. And then my interest in landscape led us to start a landscape design build company called Linden Land Group, which we did for 15 years. And we did a lot of ecological restoration as part of that work. But my passion projects through all of that were designing meadows, and pollinators were part of it. And I can cover some of the meadow work, but really today we're going to focus on pollinators and the plant selection that is best for them. I can also happily share a little bit about how we do establish meadows. It's a whole nother talk that will take at least an hour, but we're going to be doing some tours here on our property in Shelburne. Our latest venture is called Farmcraft Vermont, and basically it's a regenerative herb farm where we're producing, it's a seed to soap farm. So we're producing all of our own raw materials, and we're manufacturing essential products on site. We're continuing to do some landscape design and ecological design on the side. So go ahead to our website. It's farmcraftvermont.com, and you can book tours and also our walking meadow establishment workshop, which is going to, I think it's May 22nd. So check that out, and we'll talk a little bit about it when we get down to the end. But for now, let's talk about pollinators. Let's make sure my slides work. Okay. All right. So you want to start a pollinator garden. A lot of times people start with really small gardens, and I hear that some of you are landowners with larger pieces of land. We're doing some work here on 15 acres with some large meadows. They're in different types of meadows. So seeded meadows, plugged meadows, meadows where we're letting old hay fields essentially succeed into shrubland, and everything that happens between the time it's mowed pasture or hay up to a shrubland. And everything in between. So we're kind of experimenting with a lot of things. So a lot of times when we design gardens and meadows, clients ask us, well, we really want it to look beautiful all the time. We want it to have color all the time. And having a successive bloom sequence is important for pollinators also, so that they have forage through all different stages of their life cycle. But I always like to remind people that it's really about them and it's not about us. So our basis of our designs are not designing gardens that just look pretty. They have to be functional, and really functional from a full habitat perspective. In general, we don't design just for one species or one group of species, but we're designing for a whole system. But it is helpful to know, like if we're designing a pollinator habitat, we need to know what it is which pollinators we have and what they need specifically to thrive. So that brings me to the fact that restoration is only effective when it's targeted. So we have to know what we're restoring, what type of plant community, and then which species we're trying to protect and what they need. And a lot of times that has to do with their life cycle and when they emerge, what they need when they emerge, how they winter over. And then we try to merge those needs into a design that is also beautiful and that people will care about and want to take care of. So which pollinators are we trying to protect in New England? This is a great little breakdown that I worked on with Annie White, who was a researcher at UVM and did her research specifically on pollinators and native plants. And she was looking at what their visitation rate was for different nativars. So she was looking to see, does a bee land on an aster that's a New England aster just as frequently as it lands on an Olmapotchki aster? And so she was actually counting the number of observations. And so these are percentages that she derived by observing 572 5-minute scans. And she did a lot of that here in this little cabin that I'm standing in, which was our shared design office on our property here in Shelburne. She went on, after she finished her work at UVM, she went on to found Nectar Landscapes. And so she still continues to do that design work out of Stowe. So anyway, so the pollinators we're trying to protect in New England, you'll see that the vast majority of them are bees. And the bumblebees are the majority of our native bees. European honeybees make up 30%, which is actually a fairly high percentage for something that's an introduced species. So their effect on the landscape and the landscape's effect on them is really important. We find that they share diseases now between, so native bees and are susceptible to some of the diseases that are carried by European honeybees. And there's some really fascinating work happening on increasing, well, we'll talk more about that later, but increasing essentially the immune defense systems of bees through selective exposure to different types of pollen, including sunflowers. And so we're growing about 1.5 acres of sunflowers this year, primarily for seed oil for soap, but it's also as part of our habitat plan for pollinators. So other native bees are 13%, and these are actually a lot of the small bees that you're seeing now. So the sweat bees, the miner bees, mason bees are just starting to come out. Carpenter bees, I had them buzzing around my wood cabin here just today. So they're out, but they only make up 13%. So it's really exciting when you see them early on. And they're first to emerge because they're adapted to forage on some of the small ephemeral woodland flowers. Flies are 6%. And so you see a lot of bee mimic types of flies that look like bees, but they're actually flies. Wasps and ants. I was actually really surprised to see that was only 2%, because I see tons of them on our flowers, especially the umbelliferæ. So like this is a picture of a wasp on a solitary mud dauber on Queen Anne's lace. And so they like big flat flowers. But the fact that there's only 2% of them, and they get such a bad rap, and ants are really important when it comes to carrying pollen, especially for spring ephemerals and seed from one patch to another. And then butterflies and moths are only 2%. They get a lot of attention because they're beautiful and we have an emotional connection to them. And a lot of them are specialists, so that they need very specialized types of flowers as both host plants for their larvae and also as a nectar source. And a lot of that has to do with the adaptation of their tongue length. So anyway, the thing to really remember in this is that bumblebees are 43%, and that they are generalists as opposed to a specialist. So the next question is, okay, so this is what we've got. Where did they come from and where do they live before development? And this is important because when we're restoring habitat, essentially we're trying to put back what we've destroyed, what we've taken out, what we've disassembled, I think is probably the best way of putting it. So their plant communities are groupings of plants in a certain type of environment that has several different components. So it has nesting sites, protection, and forage. And the neat thing about this slide is that it shows that it's not just different areas, but it's a progression in time also. So pollinators a lot of times will emerge and evolve through the phases of their development based on the type of food that's available in certain areas at certain times. So in the spring, when they first emerge, their emergence is often timed with the bloom of their food source. So you'll see queen bumblebees chewing the little nectar sacs off the Dutchman's breeches. And that's when you know that they've emerged and they're looking for high value food to start their nests. And it's also why all those spring ephemerals are so important, but also why invasive species in woodlands is so detrimental, because they shade out a lot of these ground cover type plants. So anyway, so you've got these spring ephemeral blooming, they're native bees emerging at the same time, and then as the flowers sort of move out into the sunlight, so I think they kind of migrate into the margins, you'll start to see the second stage. So a lot of times they've had their first brood, and then it's they're beginning to actual forage. And then you move into upland meadows and then into a wetland edge, and that's really following the moisture. So as upland meadows, the summer, it warms up, it dries out a little bit. You get your first flush of blooms while there's still moisture in the ground in those big open areas. And then as it starts to dry out and warm up even further, the blooms sort of move towards the water, right? So you start to see more blooms happening on wetland edges. And that's also where you'll start to see more pollinators because they're following the moisture, they're following that nectar. So specifically in these areas, what kinds of plants do they need? So the next question we want to ask in relation to that is, who are we trying to feed? And it's a question of generalists versus specialists. So as we're putting together a planting list essentially, and we're trying to figure out who we're feeding, what they're eating, and how much of each group or category should we include in this plant list. It makes sense that if bees, especially bumblebees, are 50 to 80% of all pollinators, and most of those are generalists versus specialists, we would want about 80% of our plant list to make up generalist type plants. That would be great forage for bees. Luckily, they love a lot of different kinds of plants. So this is a great list that comes from the UNH Bee Lab. And I like it because they're actually not, they're not qualifying, they're not placing a value on a native plant versus a non-native plant. They're showing that, brown knapweed, incredibly invasive plant, is still an incredible forage plant for bees. The same is true for honeysuckle. And I remember when we were doing some restoration work and we were doing some invasives removal, on some Nature Conservancy land, they asked us to wait to remove the honeysuckle until after the blooms were done, specifically so that the bees could finish foraging. And then we did some removal. Also on there are some, goldenrod. You talk about a generalist plant that is, you see so many different species on it. There was a National Bee Association meeting in Burlington a couple years ago. And I remember I was up at UVM on the day that they were there. And I mean, it's people from all over the world. And it was in the fall and September, late August. And they were just agog over our goldenrod, and I think I had just heard from a client about how they wanted to rip out their goldenrod. They were so sick of it. It's so invasive, it's so aggressive, it takes over. And here are all these professional beekeepers, apiary managers and entomologists saying, you have a gold mine of food in your state. So I guess there are things that maybe we don't value from a landscape design perspective that from a pollinator perspective has incredible value. Our European honeybees, so we have 6 colonies here on the farm, they would die without goldenrod because it's their last food that they store for the winter. And it makes a very rich honey. And I think it's also probably full of all kinds of antioxidants. And I guess my point is there are things in plants that are beneficial to insects that we're just learning. All the research that's being done at UMass Amherst right now on sunflowers and the effects on bee immune defense systems is pretty fascinating. So anyway, so this is just sort of like the idea of let's put about 70 to 80% of our plant list should be good for generalists. It's not going to be this list because there's a bunch of stuff on here that I'm not going to suggest that we continue to seed out, but it gives you an idea. So specialist bees are a smaller population, but they're also really important. And so we don't want it to all just be generalist food. If we have to support these minor populations because they're the key to biodiversity, they're gonna keep our adaptation safety net, meaning you have to have things that are fit the little corners. You can't just keep aiming for the center of the bullseye. And again, UNH Bee Lab has done some really neat stuff on looking at specialist plants. Luckily, some of them, like Anise hyssop, are easy to come by in the nursery trade. So I'll show you that those are definitely included in our plant list as well. So when we were sort of trying to come up with our list, which we called the Super70 list because it ended up being 70 plants long, we looked at a bunch of different sources. And one of them was looking through the Pollinator Partnership lists and the Xerces Societies lists and UNH Bee Lab and UVM and a bunch of other, I can't even remember them all. It was a lot of different sources. And I was going to switch screens and just show you quickly what this document looks like. You're welcome to, and I encourage you to just look it up yourself. So it's Pollinator Partnership, and you can just type in your zip code, and it's going to come up with a regional guide. So if you were living in Maryland, it's going to come up with that regional guide, and they're based on ecoregions as opposed to USDA grow zones or something like that. So that's nice. It's a little more tailored. But let me try stop sharing this, start sharing. my other screen. Of course, now it's not going to work for me. Oh. There we go. Thanks for your patience. All right. So can you all see that now? Lisa, can you give me a shout out? Yes. Okay,
yep,
great.
it's not in presentation mode though, just so you know.
Okay. Well, I'll use this to scroll down and show you.
Perfect.
It's very long, but basically I was going to get to, they have a nice breakdown of the types of pollinators, but what I really wanted to get down to was their plant lists.
And where do they find this?
So it's Pollinator Partnership. And let's see, you can go to choose, right up here on my screen, you can see choosenatives.org. But it's
okay,
also
I'm just putting that in the chat box.
Yeah, it's also on the Pollinator Partnership website. And you know what, maybe there's a source at the, no, of course it's not going to tell you. Anyway, I just wanted to go and show you sort of what their plant list looked like, and one of the reasons why we decided to develop our own. It's very handy in that it gives you the botanical name and the common name. It divides it by trees and shrubs, perennial flowers, and then it gives you the height and the color and the sun and the soil, and it gives you a little bit of the visitation by pollinator. It doesn't really help you design something, and it doesn't group things by plant community, which is what we were really trying to help people with. Like if you've got a certain area in your yard and it's wet, or you have a shady area, which of these plants will work? I mean, it tells you sun and part shade, but it's quite a bit of sorting to go through. But it's there as a resource, and it does include some things that we did not decide to include. So I just wanted you to see that it was there. This one is kind of neat, is it actually goes by bee, so bumble, a digger, carpenter. So if there's a population that you really wanted to try to, especially a specialist to support, you could maybe pull out some salvia or whatever. So, all right, let me go back to my slides. No, come back. There we go. Where did my share go?
There we go, it's coming up.
Awesome, thank you. All right, so we said, hang on 1 second. That we wanted to develop our own. And part of the reason why is because we wanted it to be grouped by plant community. And also we wanted it to really represent what we were seeing here in Vermont. And some of the things on the list I found were things I would see, say, in New York or in the Hudson Valley area, but not on our side of the lake. So anyway, so this is our Super 70 list. It's 50 perennials, 15 shrubs, and 5 trees. I will send a copy of this to Lisa to share with all of you. And the actual version has, which pollinators specialists to our hosts or have some relationship to them. So then we started to break it down into plant community. So this was our list for woodlands that we used a lot. The other part of it was that we wanted it to be plants that I knew I could get in large quantities, either as plugs. And if you don't know what a plug is, I get this question a lot. It's in the landscape trade, you can buy plants in different container sizes. So a plug is really the smallest you can get. And it's in a tray. So there's a 34 count plug or a 50 count plug or a 72 count plug. And that's as the number of plants that are available in a 1x2 plastic tray. And generally we would try to get 50 count deep plugs, which are 5 inches deep, the root zone. And that was important for establishment in meadows to have that much depth. In woodlands, we would use 32 count plugs, which is a shallower on purpose. It's a fatter, wider, shorter plant, and it's adapted to be able to plant around tree roots. And so it's already training and encouraging roots to go more laterally. So anyway, so these were plants that I knew I could get quite a few of and work into a woodland. In margins and hedgerows, again, these are, so the P's and S's on the left is perennial and shrub. These were ones that we used a lot. It's not the full list, but it was definitely something that we found that we used quite a bit. I would say that our aster list alone is long. It's like a dozen different species. But I particularly like some of them on these lists. We also would have an upland meadow list. And so these are plants that could tolerate a little bit drier. A lot of them have tap roots. They can handle denser soils, or at least clays that start out moist and then turn drier later. And you'll see like Monarda fistulosa. It's we would buy it both in plugs and as a seed because it was a great quick fill-in, and it's not so persistent that other things later wouldn't take over. I love Appalachian mountain mint, which is on there, pycnanthemum, which always tongue ties me. Of all the asters, the Aster oblongifolius is the most tolerant of dry conditions. Most of them like it a little on the wetter side. Goldenrod, there's so many different types of goldenrod. Most of what you see in the fields wild is just Canada goldenrod, but there's actually quite a few species in the nursery trade that are a lot of fun to play around with and that you find in different areas. Like there's a woodland goldenrod that we find on the shores of Shelburne Pond here. It's a great little shade plant. And whereas the Solidago rigida is quite tall. So if you wanted something that has a little more show to it, it's kind of fun. And then our wetland edge, these are the ones in my own field here in Shelburne that we see quite a bit of. There's also monkey flower, which isn't on here, which just started to appear last year, which was a lot of fun. And then I always include garden and farm. So these are plants that maybe aren't going to be Northeast natives, but are still going to provide habitat. And I like to include the things that are weeds also, because they show up in people's fields that were originally seeded as pasture, or things that have blown in, and it helps people identify them, if nothing else, to know that wild potentilla, the sulfur cinquefoil, is a weed, but it's also a native plant, whereas bird's-foot trefoil is not a native plant. It was introduced, but it's great forage. So it's hard to know sometimes what is good and what is bad. Anyway, so we would take these plant community lists and then help people try to figure out, how does that relate to my backyard? So how do I take a native plant community like an upland meadow? Where would I put that in my yard? Or a wetland edge? Maybe that's really just a wet spot in your backyard where you see standing water in the spring and then it dries out, and you're tired of mowing it and you want it to be a meadow and you really want it to be beneficial for pollinators. Well, you would select the plants on that wetland edge plant list, and then we would go through the process of transitioning your lawn into a wetland meadow. And so the next question is, well, how do you do that? So some general tips. The picture on the left, there's a lot of reasons why it exists. It's economical. People are busy. They don't have time to dedicate to or resources. I mean, it's expensive to get it started. But I do think that we need to maybe shift our priorities so that we're investing a little bit more in habitat everywhere, both in large acreage and also in suburban and urban areas. So things to avoid: monocultures of lawn, highly modified hybrids. So when you go to the garden center now, you probably, so like you want some echinacea. Echinacea is something that isn't a Northeast native, but is still acceptable in terms of providing great pollen and nectar, and it's not harmful by any means. So you go to the garden center and you're going to get some echinacea and coneflower or whatever, and you show up and there's like 30 different kinds, and some are doubles and they look like they have top hats and they're green, and some are yellow and some are purple and some are pink and some are orange, and you're like, well, which one do I pick? So first of all, it's helpful to know how those different colors and shapes came to be. So in the instance of echinacea, so there's 2 or 3 actual native species. One is a yellow, one is a purple, and when they crossed them, they ended up with the oranges and some of the, like the Cherokee sunset and the sort of the rainbow color echinaceas. The problem with that is that certain species are adapted to use and co-evolved over eons, right, to use certain plants. So whether it's they're like a bee tongue is just the right length to get to the nectar of the coneflower. When you put a top hat on it, and a top hat I mean like a double flower, it can't get in there anymore, you know. So and there's lots of other examples of changing leaf color, of changing things that we do for aesthetic reasons have biochemical results. And so that leaf may no longer be palatable, or it may even be poisonous to a larval stage of caterpillar. So it's important to, as best we can, pick the straight species. Nurseries are getting much better about labeling that and making them available. For when we started 15 years ago, it was really hard to find those plants in local nurseries. And so I was always asking them to special order stuff, which they hated. And finally, we would just start buying directly in from native nurseries. So, but anyway, now it's come a long ways. You can buy most, a lot of native plants at most garden centers. So what else? So it's good to have a wide range of flower shapes and sizes. So within, so if you're sticking with straight species, you can still pick things that are globe shaped, flowers that have a flat top, flowers that have more of a daisy type shape. And that way you can, without really knowing exactly which plants are adapted to which insects, you're providing a buffet, right? So you're providing a lot of different choices. And the same's true for bloom time. So you want to have bloom continuity. So to start early spring and end up in late fall. And then especially purples and yellows and whites for bees, because those are the colors that they see. And remember, 80% of our pollinators are bees, and especially bumblebees are threatened in terms of forage, partly because we think white and yellow is boring. So we go for really crazy colors that aren't necessarily the best forage. Red for hummingbirds, even though they're less than 1% of our pollinators, we still love them and they still need food. And then to include flowers in lawn areas. So I'm constantly telling people to love their clover. It's not just a beautiful plant, but it stays green when it gets hot and dry and your lawn turns brown. And it has amazing nitrogen fixing potential and will help your grass stay green also. Masses, groups of 7 or more of each species. So when we're designing a plan, or when you go to the garden center, it's so tempting to be a dabbler, to get one of everything. But that's not the way bees forage. So they like to, when something's in bloom, make, I can't remember how many stops it is, but it's like 25 stops before they fill up their pollen sacs, fly back to their nest or their hive, unload, tell everybody what they just found, do their little bee dance, and then fly back to that same spot. So if they only have one flower of each type, it's not efficient for them to stop and fly and find between all those different types. It's also hard for them to communicate what they've found. So it's nice to have masses. And usually if you go into nature, that's what you find. So like right now, if you go into the woods, you see a mass of bloodroot or a mass of trillium. Same sort of thing when you see a mass of solidago. It's usually not just one plant. And then a higher percentage of high value favorite forage plants. So those are the ones that are on the Super 70 list. So in general, stick with the list. All right, so I didn't really get through the whole things to avoid. I got hung up on nativars. Plants from distant places, tropical plants. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have some fabulous patio pots. I do. I have hibiscus and banana, and I'm not saying you shouldn't have your grandma's favorite lilac, or your, I have a tree peony that was a wedding gift, so there's nothing wrong with those. If you think back to that landscape design where the different zones around the house, and then there was the garden, which was right around the house, you can still have that too. So that's, I do a whole talk called cohabitat gardening, which is about some for us and some for them. So it's just important to have both. I'll talk just a minute about mulch. So in general, in herbaceous gardens, gardens that are mostly perennials and annuals or grasses, so something that when we're mimicking a meadow type habitat. If you look underneath the surface at the soil, the microbes living in the soil are a higher percentage of bacteria versus fungi. And if you go into the woods, it's reversed. So it's a much higher percentage of fungi and a lower percentage of bacteria. And there's we just had a fun soil webinar last night with a soil scientist that was describing how that balance between bacteria and fungi shifts in succession going from pure disturbed soil up to stable woodland ecosystems, and how it's important that we mimic when we're designing gardens, that we help nurture the soil biology that matches that type. I'm sorry, my family keeps texting me and I thought I turned it off. So basically, if you're growing meadows, we recommend compost, because compost has a higher percentage of aerobic bacteria than fungi. It also has fungi, but and then if you're in a woodland environment or on a margin, so say you have a house in a small clearing and then you've got woods beyond that, and you want to put a pollinator garden on the edge of the woods, that's a great place to use bark mulch. But I wouldn't put it on if I was establishing a meadow, if that makes sense. So, and the last tip is to not cut back your perennials in the fall. So all of the bees, not all the bees, a lot of pollinators use hollow stems for overwintering. And if you cut back all of those homes, and especially if you cart them away and put them in your compost pile, you've just composted next year's bees. So it's important to leave them standing at least until the first blooms emerge, because then you know they've emerged to go get the food. We use what we call chop and drop after the first bloom. So we wait until we see amelanchier, wild plum, and the first trees start to bloom. So when the willows bloom and you start to see bees, then it's probably safe to cut back your perennials, and you can cut them back and lay them in place and let the new plants come up through. And so that's chop and drop. And that just keeps the amount of a lot of those nutrients that the plant needs, you can put it right back to the plant. You can chop it up a little more if you need to, but in general. And then leaves are awesome for lots of reasons. Okay. So one thing that we would love to advocate when people are thinking about how to enrich whole neighborhoods is to design connecting habitat strips. And I have another slide, and I think it might be in my Meadow talk, where it shows it's zoomed out. This is South Burlington, and it's zoomed out, and you can see it's a sea of houses and lawn, and there's just almost no other vegetation. And if we could convince people to dedicate just 10% of their property to habitat strips, and that would essentially be a 20 by 120 strip, and you divide that in half with your neighbor, and so you are responsible for half of it, and your neighbor's responsible for half of it. Then we could provide continuous bloom and continuous cover for small mammals moving through what would otherwise be a barren wasteland to them. So what kinds of plants should you put in these connectors? Bunch grasses and flowers. So I will show you which ones. So that we have the top 20 must-haves, and that's what these are. And again, I'll get you guys a copy of these slides so you don't have to scribble madly writing them down. But when we were talking about what are those high value nectar and pollen sources, these are them. And again, it's about bloom time, it's about visitation, it's about a variety of flower shapes, and about 80% of it is for generalists and about 20% of it is for specialists. So that's how you kind of get to the nugget. And then we put it into a basic border design plan. So the idea is that, this is only 15 by 55, and we were just talking about something slightly larger, but it's about that And you can see they're in groupings of at least 7, 7 to 9. I think Baptisia is 5, only because Baptisia is a big plant. It acts more like a shrub really than a perennial. And you could probably move these around, like the layout. I always think of a layout as being a planting plan is general guidance, so it's a tool for me to make sure that I have something for each bloom time, and that all of the Mays aren't in one corner and all the Septembers are in another corner. But that being said, I always tweak it when I get there. But you can see sort of at least what that density looks like, sort of 3 rows, short in the front, tall in the back. If you were sharing it with a neighbor, you might alternate that a little bit. So put some shorts on both sides so that it has more of an apex in the middle. Oh, I did include this slide. So this is, zoomed out, South Burlington. Before the purples in there, you can see that there's just really nothing. And this isn't a brand new neighborhood. This has been around for a while. So, it's an investment, but I also think that it's a value proposition. It's a decision that we make about the type of world we want to live in. So, lawn desert. It also doesn't happen right away. This is a meadow that we built up in South Hero, and I've talked about it in other slides quite a bit, other presentations. It was, about an acre, and the first 2 years didn't look like much. And the owners almost, one of the owners almost mowed it down and turned it back into lawn. And I was like, just wait till the 3rd year. And the 3rd year came, and sure enough, all those plants that were sleeping suddenly were leaping, and it was really showy. And what's important is that it continues to be showy. So it's, there are some plants that we have to put back in every once in a while because they are flash in the pans. They don't last. They're not intended to be long lasting. So, but in general, for the most part, it's a pretty stable planting. Plant sources. So we get native seed through 2 sources, Roundstone and Ernst seeds. I would also say we get some mixes from Prairie Moon, which is a retail nursery. Roundstone and Ernst are really geared towards restoration. And so some of their seed mixes are like, you'll laugh at some of the names, but there's like pit mining restoration mix, but they do have some nice mixes for the East. The other thing is to look for when you're looking for plugs, it's all about timing. So nurseries sell out. So like they're pretty much sold out now for spring. And so we're looking at their 2nd crop, which will be ready in July, August. And that's about as late as we generally want to put plugs in. So we then usually design big meadows during the rest of the growing season with the assumption that we're going to plant the following May. And then we place an order in January, February, which is really frustrating to enthusiastic homeowners that want to put in plugged meadows now. And the same sort of thing goes for seed. So a seed plan would be and we're going to, like I said, here at Farmcraft in Shelburne, we have different meadows in different stages. So we have a field that we're tilling this spring. We'll sow it in buckwheat this summer, which is a great nectar source for bees. And then this fall, we will turn that in and fall seed. So then that seed will germinate next spring. And then there's a so next June, there's a particular height mowing cut that we make to cut back the weedy species that are sort of aggressive. And then the second June, same thing, but a little bit higher. And then it's really the third year later, so it's 4 years down, where you really have a stable meadow from seed. But it's 10 times cheaper to do it from seed than it is to do it from plugs. So if you have just a small area, it's worth doing it in quart-sized plants. And you can get those up at Riverberry Farm and also at Gardener Supply. And Horsford's, I'm sure, too. So there's lots of places where you can buy quarts and gallons. It's just expensive to do that on a large scale. So I would say in closing, like I said, we're doing quite a bit here. We have meadows that we've done by plugs, and actually I have a slide of this is our property in Shelburne, and so the run by the road, the first one by the road, so this one right here, that is the one that we're tilling and putting into buckwheat. We've already tilled it. It's getting planted in buckwheat, and then it'll get fall seeded this fall. We have these little native trial sections that we did with Annie White a long time ago, where we tried different methods of combinations of plugs and seed and split seeding and tilling. And then we have our large meadow that was essentially a hay field 6-7 years ago. I think it's been 7 years now since it was mowed. And so we have mowed it, actually, we've mowed it once since then, 2 years ago. And so we're watching to see what comes in when we remove invasive species. We reseed with native species and then mulch it. And then this last area is our shrubland restoration for golden winged warbler and for a couple other things, where we're letting the dogwood and the willow come back in. It just happens to be on this divide. It's pretty wet in here, and that's part of it. And then this habitat hedgerow, we're planting a lot of shrub species like aronia and ilex, and so these shrublands we're letting just natural succession, and this one we're actually planting. So yes, so you can sign on our website, which is right here, farmcraftvt.com. You can sign up for tours, and which we do on Saturdays. We will start doing on Saturdays in mid-May, and there's a limit of 10 people per tour, and we probably are going to change it so there's just one full property tour a day, because I imagine with everybody's questions it'll take a while. And we are still trying to farm. But there's also going to be some field workshops where we will go through and talk about maintenance and seed selection and invasive control, because that's a big one. So I think that's it. I think I've got like 5 minutes left for questions.
That sounds good. We have a few in the chat box. We have one that came on early that said they have a small high tunnel, and I'm seeing a lot of insect activity of flies and bees and other insects. So the question is, are there suggestions on providing early season blooms?
In a small high tunnel. Interesting. That's a really good question. I don't know. So if in the high tunnel, if it's just a soil base, or is it fabric and you're doing containers? If it's a soil base and you're looking to just seed it so that you have, pollination for food, there's a seed mix by Prairie Moon called it's like Rapid Bloom or something like that, and it's natives that come on quickly. And so that would probably be my suggestion, and that's actually what we use for disturbed soil areas, as opposed to something a little more balanced for a large new meadow, because it's a race, right? You're trying to outcompete those really fast, aggressive first succession plants.
Okay, great. Another question, is there a good resource to order native spring ephemerals from? Is it one of those places you mentioned, or?
Well, I would say that Van Berkom Nurseries in New Hampshire is a wholesale grower, but they, I was sort of part of the little bee in their gardener's ear about carrying more of them, and so they have more. Like, I'm pretty sure there's bloodroot there, and I think they had a couple others, but I'd have to look that up. I've never actually planted spring ephemerals. I find that once we remove the invasives and let a little more light back into the forest floor, that there's dormant seed and they come in on their own. At least that's been my experience here in the Champlain Valley, where it's pretty, there's already high populations.
Okay, great. Next question. I understand that some weeds are actually beneficial for pollinators, but still, how do we can control aggressive weeds like quack or crabgrass?
Yeah. So quack and crabgrass are usually there when the soil is poor. So it's compacted soil. It's there's not a lot of microbial activity, and so adding organic matter usually will help balance that out. I usually find that it's better to increase the organic matter and the microbial activity of the soil to make it a happier environment for the non aggressive weeds. Does that make sense? As opposed to trying to get rid of the aggressive weeds, because then you're not really solving the problem. You're just delaying the seed germination of those same species, and you'll never win that race. Like, there's billions of crabgrass seeds already there, but they're there because they're the only thing that can survive that environment. So if you increase the air structure, so I would aerate it, I would add some compost on top, and then I would encourage other plants to grow, and the microbiology that happens in the root systems of the good plants will deter the bad plants. Does that make sense?
Yeah. All right. Let's see. The next question is from Arlene. She said they live on a slate ledge with very little soil depth. Do you have any recommendation for plants that might be able to thrive there?
I actually do have a plant list for that plant community that I pull out for a lot of people that live on Lake Champlain along the ledges. I can email it to you directly. So send me an email. My email is on the screen, and I'll get that to you.
That sounds great. If you want to send it to me too, I can send it out to everyone as well. That would be good. All right.
Start a list.
Yeah, here's a question. We planted a small field of pollinator plants from seed last spring from the Vermont Wildflower Farm, probably about 1/8 of an acre. What should they do to take care of it? Fertilize it, leave it and let it go? And then someone with a follow-up question, like, what is the mowing schedule for a meadow? And what do you mulch with when you mulch? So it's all kind of care and feeding of the of the meadow? What should they do, or do nothing?
Yep. So Vermont Wildflower Farm. I've found that their mixes have a lot of non-natives in them, and also transient plants, things that are sort of a flash in the pan, so that they look really showy their first year, their second year. They're mostly Rudbeckia, and then you don't have a lot the third year. So I would actually overseed it. So see what comes up the second year, which is, the first 3 years are kind of, it's not going to be a whole lot your second year anyway. So definitely don't feed it. They don't need more food than is already in the minerals of the rocks of your soil. What it needs is soil biology. So basically, if you can top dress with some fine compost, I know it's 1/8 of an acre, so it's a fairly large area, but some dry, fine compost, hand broadcast while those plants are small, would be awesome. And then basically this, so if you did it last spring, so this year is its second spring. So when those plants come up, and it's going to happen here pretty soon, you're going to see sort of a striation of the weed seeds are going to jump above the flowers, the perennials. And so you're not going to have any of those annuals left that were there last year, unless they reseeded, which is probably doubtful. So basically your weeds are going to jump up, and you want to try to weed whack those weeds above your wildflower plants. That's hard to do if you don't know what the difference between them is. It's probably worth having a consult and someone come out and look at, if it's obvious, like it's thistle or it's burdock or it's, whatever your common weed is in your yard. Don't worry about the dandelions, some small taprooted plants, that's fine. They'll muscle around that. It's usually thistle that's the problem. Anything that's going to choke out light-wise those wildflowers. So you would essentially do a late May, it's probably going to be a late May zip across the top of the plants that are there, and then leave it for the rest of this year. And then you're going to do the same thing next year, but about 1 foot high. And so essentially think of it as pruning. You're cutting back and you're removing the plants that have aggressively shot up, so that it's going to allow light into those lower, slower plants in the bottom. And you don't want to add nitrogen, because that just feeds the weed plants and encourages them to grow taller quicker. The mowing schedule for a meadow. So for an established meadow, so those are the first 2 cuts. So like if it was planted last year, this June you do your first 6-inch weed whack. Next May you would do the 12-inch, May-June you do the 12-inch whack. And then the third year you don't do anything. And then the fourth year you could mow the whole thing if you felt you needed to. Our permanent established meadows are on an every 3-year mowing rotation, just to prevent succession of shrubby species. The last question was, what do you mulch with when you mulch? So when we start a new meadow from seed, there's 2 ways to do it. One, you can hydroseed. So hydroseed is when you look on the side of the highway and they've like sprayed it green. It's actually a slurry of cellulose, so like shredded up newspaper in water with seed. Unfortunately, on the side of the roads, it's bright green because they've added a dye. and they want it to look like lawn. You don't need that. But there is a sticking agent. It's kind of like a gum that helps hold it all together. We use a custom hydroseeder. His name is Brian LaFleche. He owns Summit Landworks. I haven't talked to him since before COVID, so I hope he's healthy and still in operation. I should reach out to him. But basically, we love him because he will custom mix seed mixes for us. So I can buy in a couple pounds of wildflower seed from Ernst or Roundstone. He will look at the slope and soils, figure out what type of binder is going to work in that situation, and he'll decide how thick it needs to be and how much glue essentially to add to get it to stick. And it's just the seed. For other, for commercial turf and stuff, some people add a fertilizer, and we don't use that. So anyway, so you would essentially start with bare soil, and then he would come in and spray this slurry down, and you want it to be as sort of smoothish as you can, just because it's going to help the seed from drying out. So that hydro seed is wonderful stuff. It's about 12 cents a square foot to spray it down. And I'm trying to remember, that might just be for, it depends on how much wildflower seed you're incorporating. It's about, good wildflower seed is expensive. It's probably, I think I figured it's like 7 cents a square foot, just for the seed itself. So a pound is about $125, $130. And that'll be, it's like 1/8 of an acre per pound. I think I'd have to look at that again. I can't remember. So anyway, so that's your basic schedule. You can just broadcast and mulch with straw. That works perfectly fine. We just find that your seed can wash out, your mulch can blow away, the birds can come eat the seed as soon as it germinates. It's just that little bit of insurance. If you're putting a lot into establishing a meadow, it's nice to have that extra insurance. And then the hydro seed as a slurry holds moisture, and so it helps hold without adding more water. It helps keep it moist until it germinates, which sometimes with some of the wildflower seeds is quite a while. If you were talking about mulch with gardens, I think we overuse mulch a lot. And I come at that from having used to do it for a living, apply mulch. So basically, anything herbaceous, so a perennial garden gets mulched with compost, so 1 inch of compost every year. And it's the quality of the compost makes a difference. And then if it's a woodland garden or a shrub garden or a tree and shrub garden, then we use triple shredded bark mulch. But generally, mulch is applied more for aesthetics, I think, than for the health of the plants. That's not to say that mulch as a concept is bad, because it's really good. A plant shouldn't, soil shouldn't be bare. You want to cover it with something. And the idea of no-till gardening is generally that the best mulch is green mulch, is a plant, is something that's going to continue to grow, for lots of reasons, because you need that root system below the surface for the health of all of the plants. So I could talk about this for a very long time. So we'll move on to the next one.
Cut you off now?
Yeah.
Come to a tour with Becca at the farm. That's what it comes down to. Actually, a lot of people are noting, thank you for a wonderful talk, and for they're looking forward to a walk at your place to learn more about these meadows and gardens. One last question. People have lawns. Should they wait until after their dandelions bloom to cut their lawns? What's
Yeah, I mean, that first flow, the dandelion flow, it's called a flow, is really important. I mean, the first flow that doesn't get a lot of credit is the tree flow, is maples blooming, maples and lindens. But the second flow is the dandelion flow. And so, yes, if you can wait, please do. The bees, thank you.
Let me ask you one more question. I don't know if you'll know the answer to this, but I want to investigate a little bit more. So NRCS programs for treating some invasives or doing pollinator gardens, is that, or not gardens, but establishing a pollinator meadow, are those programs that landowners can take advantage of, exactly what you're talking about?
Yes, absolutely. I was just about to look that up for another client, and I haven't looked at it recently. But yes, NRCS has some great relationships with states too, in terms of providing some funding for that.
Great. We just did an NRCS program yesterday at lunch, so that's actually on our YouTube channel, so you can learn a little bit more about the NRCS programs, and one of those is pollinators. But you also can contact your, if you look up Vermont NRCS, you can look up your local NRC office and talk to the staff there on whether something you want to do might qualify for some funding that will help you accomplish some of these goals.
Absolutely. And the Pollinator Partnership has some nice references on it also. We are a bee-friendly farm, which is their agricultural certification. And we also have, in terms of European honeybees, we just got a flow hive, which is sort of all of the hot talk in honeybees. It's an observation hive that allows you to harvest honey at any time. So it's pretty cool. You'll have to come and see it, but it'll be a little while before we get a new colony set up enough to have honey stores to be able to tap. But essentially you tap it like you would tap a keg or something of honey. And so but the idea is that you disturb the bees less, actually. So yes, anyway.
That sounds great. Well, I want to thank you for your time tonight, Becca. It was really informative. I learned that I'm a dabbler and I need to not be a dabbler. So this year, whatever I'm buying at least 7 plants of and putting them out there.
Go small if you have to. Go small. The plants will figure it out.
Well, I'll do 7 of something. That's my goal this year.
Yes, absolutely.
So thank you all for joining us tonight. We hope you have a wonderful evening and look forward to all of you improving your pollinator habitat around your home and in your woods. And we wish everyone a great night. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.